There are moments on live television that no producer can plan for. Moments that no publicist can walk back. Moments where the camera keeps rolling, the mic stays hot, and a carefully constructed public image begins to crack. Right there, in front of millions of people watching from their living rooms, their phones, their office desks. This was one of those moments. Subscribe to Prime Talk, hit that like button, and drop your thoughts in the comments below. Because what you are about to hear is not a rumor, not a tabloid headline, and not a second-hand account. This is the story of what happened when Zayn Malik sat down on one of the most boldly honest podcasts in the world and found himself face to face with questions he had spent years carefully avoiding. We are talking about Call Her Daddy, one of the most listened to shows in the United States, a platform that built its entire identity on going where other interviewers are afraid to go. A show where the questions do not stop just because a celebrity shifts in their seat or reaches for their water glass. And when Zayn Malik agreed to appear on that show, the internet collectively held its breath. Because this was not just any celebrity walking into that recording space. This was Zayn Malik, a man who had spent the better part of a decade building walls around his private life so high that even the most aggressive tabloids had trouble seeing over them. A man who left one of the most successful boy bands in music history, One Direction, and then spent years trying to define himself on his own terms. A man who dated, and then had a child with, one of the most photographed women on the planet, Gigi Hadid. A man whose personal life had been the subject of headlines, speculation, legal filings, and public statements that left more questions than answers. And yet, here he was, sitting across from Alex Cooper. For those who may not know the full scope of what Call Her Daddy represents in today's media landscape, it is worth pausing for just a moment to put it in context. Alex Cooper created something that did not exist before she built it. A space where female-led conversation could be direct, unfiltered, and deeply personal. Where guests were not there to promote a project and leave. They were there to talk. Really talk. The kind of talking that makes publicists nervous and audiences lean forward in their seats. Some of the biggest names in entertainment, sports, and culture had sat across from Alex Cooper and left the conversation slightly different than they walked in. Some had cried. Some had laughed. Some had said things they clearly did not fully intend to say out loud. Because that is the nature of the show. That is its power. It creates a kind of intimacy that lowers the guard, and once the guard is lowered, what comes out tends to be real. So when the news broke that Zayn Malik would be a guest, the reaction was immediate. Social media moved fast. Clips began circulating before the episode even dropped, simply because the pairing felt almost too significant to process. Zayn Malik, one of the most private public figures of his generation, on a show specifically designed to break through privacy. It felt like a collision that had been building for years. But why now? That was the question everyone was asking. Why, after years of silence, after years of carefully worded statements and strategic absences from the public eye, did Zayn Malik choose this moment, this platform, and this host to finally open up? Was it calculated? Was it cathartic? Was it something that someone in his inner circle advised? Or was it something he simply decided for himself? Those questions matter. They matter because they shape the entire context of what unfolded during that conversation. They matter because understanding why someone chooses to speak tells you almost as much as what they actually say. And what he said about Gigi Hadid and about his daughter Khai stopped people mid-scroll. There is a particular kind of cultural weight that surrounds celebrity parents when their relationship ends publicly. The world feels entitled to an explanation. It watches, it judges, it forms opinions based on fragments of information filtered through management teams and carefully constructed narratives. Zayn and Gigi's relationship had existed under that weight for years. And their separation, which played out in the press with all the messiness and confusion that tends to accompany the end of a high-profile romance, had left a residue of public opinion that neither of them had ever fully addressed together, out loud, in their own words. Until now, at least from one side of it. What made this moment so significant was not just what Zayn said. It was the setting. It was the fact that there were no edits, no careful PR packaging, no statement released through a spokesperson. It was a live recorded conversation where the follow-up questions kept coming, where the silences were left in, and where the emotion on his face was visible to anyone watching. By the time the episode ended, the reaction across social media was not just large. It was laid. People were not simply reacting to the content of what he said. They were reacting to the fact that he said it at all. They were reacting to what it meant for his public image, for his relationship with his daughter, and for the ongoing quiet mystery of who Zayn Malik actually is when the walls come down. This video is going to walk you through all of it. The background, the build-up, the moment itself, and everything that followed. Because understanding this conversation requires more than a 30-second clip. It requires context. It requires honesty. And it requires the kind of careful, steady storytelling that does justice to a moment that clearly meant something real. Stay with us, because the build-up to this conversation is just as important as the conversation itself. To truly understand what made that Call Her Daddy conversation so significant, you have to go back. Not just a few months. You have to go back years. Because the story of Zayn Malik is not a simple one, and the version of him that sat across from Alex Cooper was shaped by a long, complicated, and very public journey that most people only ever saw pieces of. Zayn Malik entered the world's consciousness in 2010 as 1/5 of One Direction. If you were alive and paying any attention to pop culture during that decade, you know what that means. One Direction was not just a boy band. They were a phenomenon, a cultural force that crossed continents, broke records, and created a level of fan devotion that bordered on something sociologists would study. Millions of young people around the world did not just like One Direction. They built their emotional lives around them. And within that group, Zayn occupied a particular space. He was the quiet one, the mysterious one, the one who seemed slightly apart from the energy of the others, not in a cold way, but in a way that suggested there was more going on beneath the surface than he was willing to share on a stage or in a music video. Fans sensed it. The press tried to crack it. And for years, Zayn kept that interior life carefully guarded. In March of 2015, he left the band. The announcement shook the entertainment world in a way that few celebrity departures ever have. There were fans crying in public. There were vigils, genuinely, outside of record labels and radio stations. The reaction was not proportional to what most people outside of that fandom would have expected, but it was real, and it spoke to how deeply that group had embedded itself in the emotional landscape of a generation. Zayn's stated reason was simple. He wanted to be a normal person. He wanted to live his life away from the machinery of the world's biggest pop group. He was 22 years old, and he wanted space to breathe. What followed was a solo career that proved he was not simply a face in a group. His debut solo album, Mind of Mine, released in 2016, was a genuine artistic statement. It was sensual, experimental, and completely unlike anything One Direction had ever produced. It debuted at #1 in both the United States and the United Kingdom. The lead single, Pillow Talk, became a global hit almost overnight. The music world took notice. This was not a boy band member struggling to find his footing. This was an artist announcing himself with confidence. But even as the music succeeded, the personal life was becoming more complicated. Zayn had been engaged to Perry Edwards, a member of the British girl group Little Mix, since 2013. That engagement ended in 2015, around the same time he left One Direction. The details of how it ended were disputed and messy in the way that high-profile breakups tend to be when both parties have public platforms and vocal supporters. It was around this period that Zayn and Gigi Hadid began appearing in each other's lives publicly. Gigi, by that point, was already one of the most recognizable models on the planet. The daughter of television personality Yolanda Hadid and real estate developer Mohammed Hadid, she had built a modeling career that went far beyond magazine covers. She was a presence, a brand. Someone whose personal life attracted the same level of scrutiny as her professional one. Together, Zayn and Gigi became one of those couples that the media could not stop watching. They were photographed everywhere. They appeared on red carpets, on magazine covers, and on each other's social media with the kind of frequency that suggested something genuinely significant was happening between them. For several years, they were on again and off again in a cycle that generated its own headline rhythm. They would separate, the internet would react, and then they would find their way back to each other. And then, in 2020, something changed everything. Gigi Hadid announced that she was pregnant. Their daughter, Khai, was born in September of 2020. For a brief moment, the narrative around them softened. There is a particular grace that the public tends to extend to new parents, even famous ones. The arrival of a child has a way of quieting some of the noise. But the quiet did not last. In October of 2021, reports surfaced of an altercation involving Zayn and Gigi's mother, Yolanda Hadid. The details were disputed from the beginning. Zayn released a statement acknowledging that there had been an incident but disputing certain aspects of how it had been characterized in the press. He said he had chosen not to discuss the details publicly out of respect for his daughter and the family. Criminal charges were filed, and Zayn entered no contest pleas to 4 counts of harassment. He was placed on probation and ordered to take an anger management course. It was a serious moment, and it carried consequences that extended far beyond the legal proceedings. In the weeks and months that followed, Gigi and Zayn appeared to have separated. There were no official joint statements confirming a breakup, but the evidence in their public behavior, their social media activity, and their public appearances made the situation clear enough. They were no longer together, and their daughter, who had only just turned 1 year old, was now at the center of a family that had fractured in full view of the world. For Zayn, the fallout was real. The public perception of him shifted. The quiet mystery that had once made him compelling began to feel, to some, like something less romantic. His carefully maintained privacy started to look, in the eyes of a critical public, like avoidance. Like someone who only shared what was flattering and disappeared when accountability was required. His music output slowed. His public appearances became rarer. There were long stretches of silence from him that his most loyal fans tried to fill with explanations, while his critics filled them with judgment. The artist who had launched his solo career with such force seemed, by 2022 and into 2023, to be retreating further and further from the public eye. What does a person do with that kind of weight? What does someone who has been defined so publicly and judged so publicly do when they finally decide they are ready to speak? They pick up the phone. They walk into a recording studio. And they sit down across from someone who is not going to let them get away with half answers. That is exactly what Zayn Malik did. And the world was not fully prepared for what came next. There is a specific kind of silence that happens in a recording space when a conversation shifts into territory that nobody quite expected. It is not the silence of awkwardness, exactly. It is something closer to the silence of recognition. The moment when everyone in the room, and everyone listening later, understands that something real is happening. That the script, whatever invisible script existed before that moment, has just been set aside. That silence happened during Zayn Malik's appearance on Call Her Daddy. To understand the weight of what unfolded, you first have to understand what Alex Cooper does that most interviewers do not. She listens. Not in the performative way that some hosts listen, nodding along while mentally preparing their next question. She listens in the way that a person listens when they are genuinely trying to understand something. And then she follows the thread, wherever it leads, even when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. Especially when it leads somewhere uncomfortable. Zayn arrived at the conversation in a way that felt, at least initially, measured. This was not a man who had walked into an ambush. He had chosen this platform. He had agreed to this conversation. And in the early portion of the episode, he carried himself with the kind of careful composure that years of public life teaches you. He was present. He was thoughtful. He was, by all appearances, prepared. He spoke about his music. He spoke about his creative process, about the kind of artist he was trying to become, about the years of work that had gone into the projects he was developing. For a portion of the conversation, it felt like the kind of interview that fans had been waiting years to hear. An artist who rarely gave access, finally giving access. But Call Her Daddy is not a music podcast. And Alex Cooper did not let the conversation stay in the safer territory for long. The shift, when it came, was not sudden. It was gradual, deliberate. The kind of transition that a skilled interviewer makes when they want the subject to arrive at a destination without feeling like they were led there. Cooper moved the conversation toward relationships, toward the experience of being a public figure whose personal life had become public property, toward the particular difficulty of navigating love and loss when the entire world has an opinion about both. Zayn's body language, which had been relatively open in the earlier portion of the conversation, began to change. Not dramatically, not in a way that suggested he was about to stand up and leave, but in the subtle ways that a person's body changes when a conversation moves closer to something that carries real emotional weight. A slight shift in posture, a pause that lasted just a beat longer than the previous ones. Eyes that moved away from Cooper for a moment before returning. And then she asked about Gigi. The question itself was not aggressive. It was not designed to embarrass or to provoke. It was simply direct. Alex Cooper asked Zayn about his relationship with Gigi Hadid, about how he processed the end of something that had been so significant, and about what that chapter of his life had taught him. She asked in the way that the show asks everything, with honesty, and without an escape route built in. What followed was one of the most quietly powerful moments that Call Her Daddy had produced in recent memory. Zayn did not deflect. He did not pivot to a talking point or reach for the kind of practiced, publicist-approved language that celebrities tend to use when navigating questions about former partners. He sat with the question. Visibly, you could see him processing it in real time, making a decision in the space of a few seconds about how much of himself he was willing to give to this moment. And then he spoke about her with a kind of honesty that the public had never heard from him before. He acknowledged the relationship in full. Not in the vague, arm's-length way that celebrities often reference past partnerships, but with the specificity of someone speaking about something that had genuinely mattered to them. He spoke about the connection they had shared. He spoke about the difficulty of a relationship that existed under constant external pressure, where every argument and every reconciliation was filtered through the lens of public opinion before either of them had a chance to process it privately. He did not assign blame. That was notable. In a cultural moment where public breakups almost always involve competing narratives and carefully placed details designed to shape perception, Zayn's approach was different. He spoke about the end of that relationship the way someone speaks when they have done the internal work of understanding their own role in what happened. With accountability, but without performance. And then Cooper asked about Khai. The change in him when his daughter's name entered the conversation was immediate and unmistakable. The careful composure that he had been maintaining, the measured quality of his responses, softened in a way that felt completely unguarded. This was not a celebrity talking about fatherhood in the abstract, polished way that appears in magazine profiles. This was a man talking about his child. He spoke about what it meant to be a father, about the specific weight of knowing that a little girl was growing up watching how he handled himself, how he treated people, how he responded when life became difficult. He spoke about the experience of loving someone so completely and unconditionally that it reorganized everything else in your life around it. About how Khai had become, in the most fundamental sense, his reason for doing the internal work that the past few years had required of him. His voice, which had been steady throughout most of the conversation, carried something different in those moments. Not tears, exactly, but the kind of emotional texture that appears in a person's voice when they are speaking about something they have not fully allowed themselves to say out loud until now. The studio was quiet in a way that felt significant. Cooper, to her credit, did not interrupt it. She let the silence exist. She let the moment breathe. Because she understood, as a skilled interviewer understands, that sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply stop talking and let the truth fill the room. For the people listening to that episode in real time, the experience was striking. This was not the Zayn Malik of tabloid headlines or TMZ reports. This was not the guarded, absent public figure who had retreated from view during the hardest years of his life. This was someone who had clearly spent a great deal of time sitting with himself, examining what had happened, and arriving at a place of genuine reflection. But the conversation was not finished. And the next question Cooper asked would take everything that had just been established and push it one step further. If you want to understand what was said next, and why it mattered so much, stay right here with Prime Talk. Subscribe if you have not already, hit that like button, and keep watching. Because what came after that silence is the part of this story that nobody has fully broken down until now. There are moments in live recorded conversations that the people inside the room feel before the audience outside ever gets to hear them. A shift in energy, a change in the quality of the air, the sense that something has just happened that cannot be undone, and that everyone present is quietly recalibrating in response to it. That is what happened in the moments immediately following Zayn's words about Khai. The episode did not cut away. There was no commercial break to soften the transition, no musical interlude to give the audience time to process what they had just heard. The conversation simply continued, the way real conversations continue, carrying the weight of everything that had just been said into whatever was coming next. And that weight was considerable. For the audience listening in real time, the immediate reaction was something close to disorientation. Not the disorientation of confusion, but the kind that comes from hearing something you did not expect from someone you thought you already understood. People who had followed Zayn Malik's career for years, who had formed opinions about him based on headlines and second-hand accounts and the carefully managed fragments of his public persona, were suddenly confronted with a version of him that did not match the version they had been carrying around in their heads. Social media began moving almost immediately. That is the nature of a cultural moment in the current landscape. The conversation does not wait for the episode to end. It begins in real time, while the audio is still playing, while people are still sitting with their earbuds in or their speakers on. Clips began circulating before the full episode had finished its runtime. Screenshots of listener reactions started appearing on platforms. The name Zayn Malik began trending in a way that it had not trended in years, and critically, it was trending for reasons that had nothing to do with controversy or scandal. It was trending because people were moved. That distinction matters enormously. In a media environment that runs on conflict and provocation, a celebrity trending because they said something genuinely human and emotionally honest is not a small thing. It cuts against the grain of how the algorithm typically operates. It suggests that the moment landed in a way that went beyond the usual celebrity news cycle. Inside the conversation itself, Alex Cooper navigated the aftermath of those emotionally charged exchanges with the kind of skill that explains why her platform has reached the scale it has. She did not linger on the vulnerability in a way that felt exploitative. She did not pivot abruptly to something lighter in a way that would have felt dismissive. She held the tone of the room with a steady hand, acknowledging what had just been shared without making it feel like a spectacle. That balance is harder to achieve than it looks. When a guest gives you something real, something unguarded and emotionally significant, the temptation as an interviewer is to push harder, to mine the moment for maximum impact. Cooper resisted that temptation. She understood that what Zayn had just offered was not a doorway to deeper excavation. It was a statement, complete in itself, and it deserved to be treated as such. She asked him, gently, about what the process of getting to this point had looked like. Not the specific events, which had already been covered extensively in the press and in legal proceedings, but the internal process. The work of examining yourself honestly after a period of public failure and private pain. The experience of sitting with the parts of yourself that you would rather not look at directly. And Zayn answered in a way that continued the tone he had established. He spoke about the value of therapy, without making it sound like a talking point or a performance of self-awareness. He spoke about it the way someone speaks about something that has actually changed them, with the specific, lived language of genuine experience rather than the general, approved language of celebrity wellness narratives. He spoke about the difficulty of being a person who had always used distance and silence as a form of self-protection, and the particular challenge of learning, as an adult, that those tools were not actually protecting him. They were isolating him. He spoke about his relationship with his own emotions in a way that felt unusually honest for a male artist of his generation and his particular cultural background. There is a specific set of expectations placed on men, and additional layers of expectation placed on men from certain cultural and ethnic backgrounds around emotional expression and vulnerability. The pressure to be stoic, to be contained, to process difficulty privately and present strength publicly. Zayn did not announce that he was dismantling those expectations. He simply spoke in a way that demonstrated he had been working through them. For a significant portion of his audience, particularly the younger listeners who had grown up with his music and had followed his career through all of its turbulent chapters, this version of him was both surprising and deeply welcome. There is a hunger, especially among younger audiences, for public figures who are willing to model what it looks like to struggle and reflect and grow without packaging that process into something clean and marketable. Zayn, in this conversation, was not packaging anything. He was simply describing his experience. The discussion of Khai returned later in the conversation, in a different key. Earlier, when he had first spoken about his daughter, the emotion had been close to the surface, visible and unguarded. The second time her name came up, the tone was different, more settled, more certain. He spoke about her with the quiet confidence of someone who knows what their priorities are and has organized their life around them. He spoke about the kind of father he was working to be, not in the aspirational, abstract language of someone describing a future goal, but in the grounded language of someone describing daily choices and daily commitments. He spoke about wanting her to know him, not the version of him that existed in headlines or on streaming platforms. The actual him, the person he was becoming through the work of the past several years. He wanted her, when she was old enough to understand, to see someone who had faced difficult things and responded by trying to be better. Not someone who had simply survived the difficulty, but someone who had used it. That distinction, between surviving and growing, landed with the audience in a way that was visible in the response the episode generated. Because it is a distinction that resonates far beyond celebrity culture. It is a distinction that anyone who has gone through a period of failure or loss or public judgment understands intimately. And Zayn had articulated it not as a motivational statement or a brand message, but as a personal truth. The energy in the room, by the time the conversation began moving toward its conclusion, was noticeably different from where it had started. The careful, measured quality of the early exchanges had given way to something looser, more genuine, more human. Zayn Malik, who had spent years maintaining such a precise distance between himself and the public, had spent the better part of an hour closing that distance in ways that seemed to genuinely surprise even him. When the recording ended, the silence that followed was not the silence of discomfort. When a public figure chooses to speak after years of silence, the world does not simply receive that moment and move on. It studies it. It replays it. It holds it up against everything that came before and asks a question that only time can fully answer. Was that real? And in the weeks and months that followed Zayn Malik's appearance on Call Her Daddy, that question echoed across entertainment media, fan communities, and cultural commentary spaces with a persistence that said something important about how much this moment had actually mattered. The immediate media response was significant. Entertainment outlets that had spent years covering Zayn primarily through the lens of controversy and absence suddenly found themselves writing a different kind of story. The headlines shifted in tone in a way that was unmistakable. Where previous coverage had leaned into the mystery and the distance, the post-interview coverage leaned into the humanity. Writers who had been critical of his public silence found themselves acknowledging that what he had offered in that conversation was substantive. Not a performance of accountability, but something that carried the texture of genuine reflection. That shift in media tone did not happen by accident. It happened because the content of the conversation gave journalists and commentators something real to work with. When a celebrity speaks in generalities, the press fills in the gaps with speculation. When a celebrity speaks with the kind of specificity and emotional honesty that Zayn brought to that episode, the narrative writes itself in a different direction. There is less room for projection when someone has already done the work of being honest. For his fan base, the reaction operated on a different and more personal level. Zayn Malik has always inspired a particular kind of devotion in his audience. Not simply the admiration that attaches to talent, but the deeper kind of connection that forms when fans feel they understand something about a person that the broader world does not. His silence over the years had tested that connection for many of them. The long gaps between music, the absence from public life, the years where the person they had followed so closely seemed to be receding rather than moving forward, had created a complicated emotional landscape for the people who had invested so much in his story. The Call Her Daddy episode gave them something they had not realized they were waiting for. It gave them context. It gave them the version of events from his own voice, in his own words, with his own emotional truth attached to it. And for many of them, that was enough. Not to erase the difficult years, but to understand them differently. To see a human being navigating an extraordinarily difficult period of life rather than a celebrity simply failing to meet expectations. The conversation around fatherhood, and specifically around his relationship with Khai, resonated far beyond his existing fan base. Parenting content, and particularly content about fathers navigating co-parenting after a public separation, occupies a significant space in contemporary cultural conversation. There is a generation of parents, and particularly fathers, who are actively trying to redefine what engaged, emotionally present fatherhood looks like. And when a global celebrity with Zayn's level of visibility speaks about that experience with honesty and vulnerability, it contributes to that conversation in ways that extend well beyond celebrity gossip. The cultural significance of that specific thread in the interview was noted by commentators who had no particular investment in Zayn's music or his personal history. Parenting writers, relationship journalists, and cultural critics who typically operated at a significant distance from pop music coverage found themselves referencing what he had said, because it touched something that was not specific to his circumstances. It touched something universal about the experience of loving a child fiercely while also navigating the imperfection of the adult relationships that surround that child. There was also a broader conversation that the interview reopened about privacy, public accountability, and the terms on which celebrities engage with their audience. Zayn had spent years being criticized for his silence, for the way he seemed to disappear when the story around him became difficult. That criticism had followed him through multiple news cycles and had contributed significantly to the complicated public perception that surrounded him by the time he sat down with Alex Cooper. His decision to speak, and the way he chose to speak, challenged the assumption that silence is always avoidance. Sometimes silence is the work happening out of view. Sometimes the person who disappears from public life is not running from accountability but doing the harder, quieter work of building it from the inside. That reframing did not erase the legitimate criticism that had accumulated over the years, nor did it resolve the questions that remain unanswered about certain chapters of his story. but it complicated the narrative in a way that felt honest and necessary. Public perception is rarely as simple as the dominant story suggests, and moments like this one serve an important function in reminding audiences of that complexity. For Zayn himself, the long-term impact of the conversation appeared to be a genuine re-entry into public life on terms that felt more sustainable and more authentic than the terms that had governed his earlier career. The pressure to be the mysterious one, the guarded one, the artist who maintained his allure through distance, had clearly taken a toll over the years. Speaking openly, on a platform designed for exactly that kind of openness, seemed to offer him something different. A way of being known that did not require performance. The story of Zayn Malik is not finished. He is still a young man with a career ahead of him and a daughter growing up watching how he moves through the world. But what happened on Call Her Daddy marked something real. A turning point, visible and documented, in the story of who he is and who he is choosing to become. That is why this moment still matters. That is why it deserves to be examined carefully and honestly rather than reduced to a trending clip or a tabloid summary. And that is exactly what Prime Talk is here to do. If this video gave you something to think about, subscribe to Prime Talk, hit that like button, leave your thoughts in the comments, and share this with someone who needs to hear this story told the right way. We will see you in the next one.